to a life of treachery and double-cross. He led his country to ruin when he threw his lot in with Hitler. Oh yes, they saw some palmy days when Il Duce confidently stabbed France in the back. He had dreams of empire before the bayonets of the Allies deflated this false prophet. He was captured once before and rescued by German paratroops. This time he had no such chance. Partisans tried him along with his sweetheart and several henchmen. Just as these pictures show the trial previously of other key fascists and collaborators. He was brought before a firing squad, and in this manner he died, as tyrants should, and was hung up by his heels, a fitting and glorious end.
He was a global phenomenon. He had been in power since 1922, a full 11 years before Adolf Hitler would become Chancellor of Germany. He was the pioneer, the world's first fascist, a term he had forged and embodied. His black shirts had marched on Rome when Hitler's beer hall putsch had ended in failure and imprisonment. Foreign dignitaries, Winston Churchill among them, had praised him for his vigor and his supposed triumph over chaos. In his own mind, and in the perception of many, Mussolini was the master, and Hitler was the passionate but unrefined disciple. This dynamic was cemented in their first meetings. When they first met in Venice in June 1934, Mussolini went to great lengths to stage-manage the event as a lesson from a senior statesman to a junior partner. He deliberately scheduled the meeting to conflict with a critical Nazi rally in Germany, forcing Hitler to choose between his own party and his Italian mentor. He arranged the venue to maximize his own grandeur and conducted much of the discussion in Italian, which Hitler did not speak, forcing the German leader to rely on interpreters. Mussolini even made a point of wearing a simple civilian suit, a stark contrast to Hitler's more formal attire, a subtle power play to suggest he was so confident he needed no uniform. He saw himself as the architect of fascism, patiently tutoring a volatile and somewhat uncouth protégé in the nuances of totalitarian rule. The core of this Italian strategy was the concept of spazio vitale, living space, in the Mediterranean and North Africa. This was to be Italy's sphere of influence, a new Roman Empire. Mussolini saw Central and Eastern Europe as Germany's natural area for expansion. In his mind, this was a clean, gentleman's agreement between two great powers. They would parallel each other, allies but not subordinates. The Rome-Berlin axis, proclaimed in 1936, was, from Mussolini's perspective, a pact between the senior and junior members of the fascist movement. He believed he could control the pace and direction of Hitler's ambitions, using the relationship to bolster his own prestige and achieve his imperial goals without direct subservience. This was the foundational illusion. Mussolini believed he was the weaver of the web, never suspecting that the threads he was pulling were, in fact, slowly wrapping around his own wrists. The first faint tremors of Mussolini's crumbling authority within the Axis came not on a battlefield, but in the diplomatic chambers of Europe. The first test was Austria. Italy considered Austria its backyard, a vital buffer state against German expansion. In 1934, Mussolini had mobilized Italian troops on the Brenner Pass to deter a potential German annexation after the assassination of Austrian Chancellor Engelbert Dollfuss, a man Mussolini considered a protégé. This was a show of strength, a demonstration that the Duce could and would check Hitler's ambitions. For a time it worked. Hitler backed down. But by 1938, the balance of power had shifted dramatically. Germany had grown immensely stronger, both militarily and economically, while Italy was straining under the costs of Mussolini's own imperial adventure in Ethiopia and his intervention in the Spanish Civil War. When Hitler decided to finally annex Austria in the Anschluss of March 1938, he did not consult his senior partner in Rome. He informed Mussolini only after the decision was irrevocable. This was a profound breach of the imagined partnership. The Duce was not a co-decision maker. He was an audience to be notified. Mussolini had little choice but to acquiesce. His resources were stretched, and his faith in the Western democracies of Britain and France was non-existent. He swallowed the insult and gave his blessing. But the message was received, and it was chilling. Hitler had acted unilaterally on an issue that was of paramount importance to Italian security. The earlier mobilization on the Brenner Pass was now a forgotten memory. The junior partner was now setting the agenda. This pattern repeated itself with other German actions, such as the remilitarization of the Rhineland in 1936. While not a direct insult to Italy, it demonstrated Hitler's willingness to act alone and gamble successfully, making him bolder and more independent. Each successful gamble increased Hitler's prestige and power, while Mussolini's own misadventures were draining Italy's. The Duce watched with a mixture of admiration and anxiety, as Hitler redrew the map of Europe with an audacity he himself lacked. He was no longer the tutor, but a spectator to a revolution he had helped inspire, but could no longer control. The partnership was revealing its true nature. It was conditional on Italian strength, and that strength was proving to be an illusion. The Axis was not a bridge between two equal pillars. It was a spoke, and Rome was rapidly becoming subsidiary to Berlin. Paradoxically, as the cracks in the partnership widened, Mussolini's response was to demand a tighter, more formal alliance. This was driven by a toxic cocktail of jealousy, insecurity, and a desperate need to reaffirm his importance on the world stage. He watched Hitler's successes, the bloodless conquests of Austria and the Sudetenland, with growing pique. He, the senior fascist, had nothing to show for it but a costly war in Ethiopia and a stalemate in Spain. He feared being sidelined, becoming irrelevant. His solution was the pact of friendship and alliance between Germany and Italy, which would soon be known to history by its more apt nickname, the Pact of Steel. The negotiations for the pact in May 1939 were a masterpiece of German manipulation. The Italian foreign minister and Mussolini's son-in-law, Galeazzo Ciano, who had grown increasingly skeptical of the Germans, pushed for a pact that would guarantee peace for several years, giving Italy time to rearm. Hitler and his foreign minister, Joachim von Ribbentrop, assured him that was their intention. But the language of the treaty itself was terrifyingly vague and unconditional. It committed both nations to provide full military support to the other immediately and with all its military forces in the event of a war, regardless of who started it or why. Mussolini, blinded by his desire for symbolic parity, signed it. He believed the pomp and ceremony in Berlin were a recognition of his equality. In reality, he had signed a blank check. He had surrendered Italy's freedom of action without receiving any concrete guarantees about German plans or a timeline for peace. He had chained his weaker, unprepared nation to the war machine of a stronger, reckless one. The moment of signing was the peak of the illusion. Mussolini stood beside Hitler, believing the crowds were cheering for two equals. He did not see that he was merely adding his signature to a document that formalized his subordination. The Pact of Steel was not a partnership contract. It was a vassal's oath, written in steel and delusion. The reality of the Pact of Steel crashed down upon Mussolini just a few months later, in the final days of August 1939. The German war machine was poised to invade Poland. The world held its breath, and Mussolini was kept almost entirely in the dark. He received a letter from Hitler on August 25th, informing him that an attack on Poland was imminent. The Duce was panic-stricken. Italy was in no condition to fight a major European war. Its military was under-equipped, its resources depleted. The critical moment, the point where the puppet saw his strings, came during a series of frantic phone calls and communications. On August 26th, Mussolini drafted a response to Hitler. In it, he was forced to admit a humiliating truth. Italy could not enter the war unless Germany supplied them immediately with massive amounts of war materiel, everything from fuel to coal to steel. It was a list of demands that was both a confession of weakness and a desperate plea for a way out. The German response was not a conversation between allies. It was a dismissal. Hitler, through his officials, essentially told Mussolini that he understood, and that Italy's help would not be needed. The invasion of Poland would proceed with or without him. This was the ultimate negation of Mussolini's self-image. He was not a valued partner whose military strength was crucial to the cause. He was a liability who could be politely, but firmly benched. The man who had dreamed of a new Roman Empire was being told to sit quietly while history was made without him. The phone call, or the moment the message was delivered, was one of the most humiliating of Mussolini's life. The Pact of Steel, which he thought guaranteed his place at the table, had merely revealed that he was no longer even in the room when the real decisions were made. As Germany unleashed its blitzkrieg on Poland in September 1939, Mussolini was forced to declare a status he invented: non-belligerence. It was a pathetic, face-saving term for neutrality. For the founder of fascism, a doctrine built on war and violence, to be neutral in the great conflict he had helped provoke was an unbearable paradox. He was now a spectator to Hitler's war. He watched with a mixture of awe and horror as Poland was crushed in weeks, a feat his own military could never have accomplished. This period, from September 1939 to June 1940, was a prolonged and public humiliation. The Italian press, which for years had screamed for war, was now forced to explain why Italy was not fighting. Mussolini paced the halls of the Palazzo Venezia, furious and impotent. He was trapped. To enter the war would risk catastrophic defeat for his unprepared nation. To stay out was to admit his irrelevance and become a subject of mockery. The Pact of Steel was now a hollow joke, and he was the punchline. He watched as Hitler turned west, overrunning Denmark, Norway, the Netherlands, Belgium, and, most shockingly, France, Italy's historic rival, and a nation whose Maginot Line he had considered impregnable. The German success was so swift and so total that it destroyed any remaining pretense of balance within the Axis. Hitler was not just the senior partner, he was the sole arbiter of fascist Europe's destiny. Mussolini's inaction during this critical period proved, beyond any doubt, that Italy's role was not that of an equal, but of a follower who was too slow and too weak to keep up with its leader. The Duce was no longer the architect. He was a contractor, and an unreliable one at that, waiting for instructions from the real master of the site. The final grotesque act in this drama of subservience came in June 1940. France was already defeated. The French army was in disarray. The government was collapsing, and German troops were sweeping through the country virtually unopposed. It was at this moment, when the battle was already won, that Mussolini finally led Italy into the war. On June 10, 1940, he stood on his balcony and declared war on a dying France and a beleaguered Britain. It was not an act of courage or of strategic necessity. It was an act of sheer cynical opportunism, a desperate attempt to grab a seat at the victor's table before the feast was over, to claim a share of the spoils he had done nothing to earn. Hitler understood the move for what it was. He was contemptuous of it. He now saw Mussolini not as a partner, but as a jackal, sneaking in to scavenge the kills of a lion. The Italian military's subsequent pathetic performance against the shattered remnants of the French army in the Alps only confirmed this view. The invincible Duce could not even achieve a decisive victory against a nation that had already surrendered. From this point onward, the relationship was stripped of all its illusions. Mussolini was a puppet. He would be dragged into Hitler's disastrous invasion of the Soviet Union. He would have to beg for German help to salvage his own failures in North Africa and the Balkans. He would be summoned to meetings where Hitler would lecture him for hours, monologuing about his grand strategy, with the Duce reduced to a silent, sullen listener. The moment he realized his status was not a single event, but a slow, dawning horror that culminated in the shame of declaring war on a corpse. He had traded the dignity of Italy for a place in Hitler's shadow, and he now found that shadow was a prison.